Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Cerrone has come out today to announce he is coming out of retirement and he's on the juice. Today, Donald Cerrone has announced that he is coming out of retirement to complete 2 more fights in his UFC career, making his total UFC fights 50, which is the record right now. I believe the person that is holding it currently is Jim Miller, but they are close. I believe it is even with the current amount of fights they have. If I'm mistaken, I think Jim Miller might have more, but I'm not worried about that right now. What I'm trying to talk about today is Donald Cerrone and what I think about him coming back, and I, along with a lot of other people, don't think that this is a good idea. His last fight was against Jim Miller at UFC 276, where he did get choked out in the second round. In that fight, he didn't look the best. I'm gonna just be honest with you, he looked pretty shitty. If you rewatch the fight, you'll know what I'm talking about. Looked very slow in the stand-up exchanges, and when he got to the ground, he got submitted easily. Got taken to the ground a bunch of times in the first round too, and didn't have any success trying to fight to get his own submission or to get back onto the ground at all until the bell rang. Come second round, got kicked in the head, dropped. From there, Jim Miller tried to latch up a guillotine choke, which he got it, and then from there, Donald Cerrone famously retired. If we look at his fight before that against Alex Morono, he did get standing TKO'd pretty badly. In that fight, he had nothing for Alex Morono in the exchanges, which is crazy because Alex Morono is pretty shit. Alex Morono was swinging to take his head off in that entire fight, and what ended up happening was he got hit with an overhand, stunned against the cage, and then standing TKO'd and stopped. Before that, he had a majority draw against Nico Price, but got overturned because Nico Price tested positive for marijuana. Even in that fight, you can make a really strong case that Nico Price won the fight. Donald Cerrone didn't look the fastest, looked pretty slow, which has been a trend in the last 3 fights looking at his career. Fight Anthony Pettis at UFC 249, which was a lot closer than people seem to think. Donald Cerrone did look good in the stand-up exchanges, but before that, he got knocked out by Conor McGregor. So he's on a bit of a losing streak. If you want to count the fight with Nico Price as a loss, which it basically was, that puts him on a 7-fight win streak. 1 loss away from tying Tony Ferguson's 8-loss streak. What do I think about him coming back? He did say that in his retirement, he's been taking TRT and steroids, which at him being 41 years old, steroids on an older body do tend to have a lot of negative effects as well. The biggest thing with him in his last few fights is that he's looked really slow and it hasn't been competitive in a lot of the exchanges. His reaction time is off by a lot, and that's what's been leading him to getting not only TKO'd by Alex Morono in their fight. In his last 2 fights, he did get out of there pretty early, with both fights ending before the second round could really start. In the case of Alex Morono, he did get knocked out at the end of the first. And mind you, he was 38 in both of those fights. Donald Cerrone is now a 41-year-old man, so it's going to be interesting to see how he stacks up against the rest of the welterweight division. I've been seeing people call for a Tony Ferguson match. It would make sense since they're both on pretty historic losing streaks. For a lot of those that don't know or don't remember, Tony Ferguson was the man to send Donald Cerrone into his losing streak when he did TKO him at UFC 238. Since then, Donald Cerrone hasn't really been the same. If I'm being honest, we can't really put all the blame onto Tony Ferguson. Donald Cerrone is a 41-year-old man, and at the time, he was pushing 38. Currently, his record is 36 with 17 losses, 8 of them by knockout, 2 of them by submission. Taking a lot of damage. 41-year-old man is on steroids, is coming off of the juice to come back and have 2 more fights. I don't see this going well for Donald Cerrone at all. Because we got to think about it. How does he stack against the rest of the welterweight division? Well, there is Nick Diaz, old, 41 years old. That'd be a good fight for him. 2, old heads, 2 legends. Tony Ferguson's another one too. Tony Ferguson's still looking to fight. Tony Ferguson recently coming out and saying that he is too old to retire. He is another one that is 40 years old. It'd be an interesting fight to see where they both stack up against each other now that they're both old men. I think with the way UFC does things and what they're probably going to end up doing is having him fight a young and hungry contender. For whatever reason, I see them making him fight Renat Fakhretdinov or someone like a Brian Battle or someone like a Muslim Salikov or even another old head like Santiago Ponzinibbio. So there's a couple of options for Cowboy Cerrone. None of them are good. Cowboy was a company man accomplishing 48 fights in his UFC run, including the WEC. Some good wins for his time like Eddie Alvarez, Benson Henderson, Edson Barboza, Al Iaquinta. So in his prime, he was a dominant fighter, mainstay in the division at lightweight. Had a couple of fights up at welterweight. Now, with him being 41, I don't see him cutting back down to lightweight. He has been fighting at welterweight in his last couple of fights. I see him sticking at that weight class with him being older. And with him coming off of the steroids as well, it's going to be harder for him to lose some of that weight that he was putting on. This isn't good. It's not good for a handful of reasons, and one of the biggest ones is that Donald Cerrone is going to be having to have someone tie his shoelaces when he's an older man. Donald Cerrone most likely has a case of CTE. This has been shown in a lot of his interviews. Him coming back for 2 more fights against a pretty stacked welterweight welterweight division with a lot of hungry contenders where he could potentially get knocked out twice since he wants to do 2 more fights. It's not a good mix for anything at all. In his video, which I'll probably just put up on screen right now,
I want to go back and get 2 more fights. When I retired, I told you I was getting my hair done and getting on steroids. So number 50. Been sitting on my mind for a while. So I've been working with Transcend the last 2 years, taking TRT, a bunch of peptides. Now we got a protocol for all you people who are like, oh, what if you get on it, you can't ever come off? Well, I now have to come off and piss clean. Fight in a few months. So watch this.
he says he's feeling good. He's ready to come back into the octagon. But the reality of it is, at his age, he's probably not feeling that good. He is on steroids currently, which he makes very apparent in his video that he is on steroids, which is probably a factor as to why he feels so good in training. Is going to have to drop the steroids in his comeback to the UFC, so it's going to be how he was fighting in his last couple of fights against some of the younger, hungrier contenders in the welterweight division currently. What does it say about older UFC fighters? I think there is an issue going on at hand where a lot of these fighters can't really put down the gloves permanently. In his retirement speech after his fight with Jim Miller, he stated that he doesn't really like fighting anymore. Going back to what I said previously, yeah, steroids is going to make you feel better in the gym. It's the whole point of steroids, and it's probably why he's making him feel better to come back and fight. But this is what I think is going to happen if he comes back and fight. They're not going to have him fight Nick Diaz. They're not going to have him fight Tony Ferguson. UFC is not that generous. They're not going to give him an older contender. They're not going to give him one of these older bums that are outside the rankings. They're going to find him somebody who is on a streak, who is on a run, and they're going to use Donald Cerrone to be a highlight reel just so that fighter can be like, I knocked out Cowboy Cerrone at 41 years old. Not much of a highlight reel now, but it is a good name to add to anyone's resume, especially with him coming out of retirement. This brings up a serious problem with a lot of the older UFC fighters, because when is enough going to be enough? If you're going to be out of the cage for 2 years, how much in that time are you going to really like fighting again? He has been in this for 48 fights so far in the UFC alone. 55 fights in his whole entire career, including amateur. A lot of knockouts, has taken a lot of damage, and is just an old man. His body's not going to be the same as it once was, even as a younger person or even before he took steroids, because coming off of steroids has a serious effect on your body. And even then, you have to look at the long term, because this is someone that's using steroids currently, admitting to it, and more than likely has a serious case of CTE and will probably need a lot of help in his older age. Something similar can be said for fighters like Tony Ferguson. 8-fight losing streak, taking a lot of damage, recently just got submitted by Michael Chiesa. When is it time to put up the gloves? The UFC isn't going to tell these fighters to stop fighting just because of the pull they bring off of pure name value alone. So it's going to come down to these fighters to decide when they want to give up, which in the case of some of them, it's not looking like it's anytime soon. Especially in the case of someone like Cowboy Cerrone, who, I repeat, has been knocked out bad 8 times, has 55 fights, 48 fights in the UFC and WEC alone, and is 41 years old. He shouldn't be in the cage. When he retired against Jim Miller, that should have been his last fight. So why are the UFC bringing him back in? All the reasons I mentioned earlier. They want to use him to prop up the next big young contender so they can be on his highlight reel and say, hey, this guy beat Donald Cerrone, who's coming back from retirement. But the reality of the situation is a win like that isn't going to look good, because Donald Cerrone is a 41-year-old man coming off of steroids who hasn't fought in over 2 years. So you have to ask yourself, who is he really going to fight, and what does he think going into this? Does he just want the record and title of having the most fights in the UFC? Does he want to come back and break that streak of his, or does he want to get a big name fight to end off his career in a bang? Or does he want all three? Who knows? And we're not gonna know until the UFC comes out and announces a fight with him, which he said he'll be fighting in 2 months. So it's gonna be interesting to see who he comes back against. I would like to see, and I think everyone else would like to see, a fight against either Tony Ferguson or Nick Diaz. But like I mentioned earlier, UFC is cruel. They're not going to do something like that. They're probably going to make him fight an undefeated hungry dog like Renat Fakhretdinov, and it's going to go out there and it's going to be like when he fought Kevin Lee and just got brutally submitted in the first round. So big ups to Donald Cerrone for coming back and taking this big risk, but we really need to talk about some of these older UFC fighters and see what exactly is going on in their head. TTE is a thing, and it's more than likely going to affect Donald Cerrone's life. If it's not already affecting it, he is gonna need help in his older age, a lot of it. I give it a couple of years before he starts talking like Tito Ortiz in his interviews. But fighters like Cowboy and Tony Ferguson need to know when to hang it up. But you have to look at it from their perspective too. All they know in their life is fighting. It's not just a game for them. It is their life. It is their source of income, and it's what they know most. So from their point of view, it has to be hard because that's all they know, and that's all they're gonna continue to know. And after fighting, what's there really left for them? They're both really old men, 41 years old. But who knows? For all I know, I could be very wrong about this. He comes back and he just smokes whatever young contender they put him up against, if they find him a young contender to put him up against. And they don't do the matches that I mentioned earlier. But knowing the UFC, they're not going to do such a thing. He'll come back, win, and go over to Sarah Type 1, win himself 2 belts at lightweight and at welterweight. But that's not going to happen, and we all know it's not. What do you think about Cowboy coming back? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Leave me your thoughts in the comments below. If you agree with me, leave a comment. If you disagree with me, leave a comment. If you like this video, leave a like. If you like videos like these, subscribe to the channel, and I'm going to see you guys in the next video. Peace.